after the age of 65. And many people of my age who are disabled would experience a tremendous lift in the quality of life. But there are reasons, I believe, that on the average, personal assistance would not cost more than the present solutions like the community-based services that the local governments provide, or residential institutions. So why not use this personal assistance? Why not test it on the population of old people? I haven't seen this anywhere. As we know, human rights, and including the Article 19, are not limited to a certain age group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for keeping up with time. I go on to our next speaker, Professor Gerard Quinn, Director of Centre for Disability Law and Policy, National University of Galway, Ireland. Also had served on the national human rights institutions in that country and has also been advisor to the President of the Republic of Ireland. Has also worked many researches for United Nations, and I actually first had a chance to get in touch with him through looking at that study he did 15 years ago with Professor Degner and other colleagues. So I have two questions for you, and there will be no reasonable accommodations for the fact that you are a lawyer and academician. But I will try to link those two questions. So I would like you to share some views on first, planning necessary for achieving transition from institutionalization to support services in local communities, and then also the resource timeline for the same goal.
Thank you very much, Chair. Okay, two quick questions and hopefully two very quick answers. Article 19 calls for a very profound shift, both in terms of ideas but also in terms of resources. And the legacy of the past is not going to be done overnight. Rome was not built in a day. And the kind of new future we're trying to lay down, likewise, is not going to be done overnight. So pretty obviously, some conception of what we call progressive achievement is going to colour or control the way in which we actually drive the process forward. And I think it's really important for the committee to pay very close attention to the way the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has handled this notion of progressive achievement. To move from a 60-bed unit to a 20-bed unit to a 5-bed unit is not progressive achievement to me. And also the committee is going to have to be very careful about regression on those rare instances where states cut back. The committee is going to have a crystal clear view as to what it considers the core content of Article 19, beyond which it will not allow any state to go. Regardless of money, regardless of resources, regardless of progressive achievement, I think there is an immediate obligation on states to begin planning, and that requires a statement of taking stock of where you are at, identifying the barriers to change, and then setting up a clear roadmap for their removal. And if I may say so, there is another immediate obligation, which is no more entrance into institutions, no more money for institutions, and no more institutions themselves. Secondly, with respect to the timeline, it's interesting because we're working here on two different timelines. We shouldn't, as Shantha Rao said earlier on, get fixated on deinstitutionalization. Article 19 is broader and deeper than just deinstitutionalization. So one timeline is ending the institutionalization, but the other timeline is actually rolling out the supports for everybody in the community to take advantage of. There I think we need very clear, crystal clear timeline from government. Realistic, it doesn't have to be overly optimistic. That has to itemize, I think, which resources are going to be dedicated and how. In other words, how are you going to shift funding from one old, inefficient system to a completely different system? How are states going to actually utilize whatever technical and other assistance is available to them from bilateral parties or multilateral parties? What is the state's catch-up plan? I was involved in another treaty monitoring body in the Council of Europe, and it emerged that the country's catch-up plan to bring autistic children into the education system would take 120 years to accomplish. Case over, okay? You have to actually have a realistic catch-up plan that allows the upcoming generation a prospect of actually being engaged in the community. When the resources are extensive, when it's going to take time, I think in this plan, the states have to be conscious on whom the burden falls short of implementing the plan. And normally speaking, this is what our American friends call the feminization of poverty, the fact that carers are disproportionately hit and families, and what we all forget is they have a right to live independently and be involved in the community as well. So there's my two, hopefully quick answers to two quick questions.
Perfect, thank you very much. That was very brief and the point. Thank you very much. We look at this panel and we see that it's slightly gender imbalanced, but we do have two female speakers. And first of those will be Jamie Bowling, Executive Director of the European Network of Independent Living. She is social anthropologist, has been cooperating with European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, and is one of the leaders of independent living movement in Europe. So Jamie, my two questions for you would be if you could share some views, because conventions should be implemented globally. It would be interesting to hear something on the concept of independent living in different cultural contexts, how we can make it work. And my second question would be something which I know very much ENIL is very vocal on, and that is the right of all persons with all types of impairments to have personal assistance. So 5 minutes is yours. Thank you kindly.
Hello, thank you. Just to start, without independent living and its pillars of peer support and personal assistance, I wouldn't be here today. And also because I was lucky to fall off a horse in Sweden, which was the country that had the first independent living legislation making personal assistance a legal right. And that I happened to meet Rudolf Ratska very early, and he was a great peer support leader. But anyway, on to the culture. When I often hear that independent living is a Western concept, it's for rich countries. Independent living is different. But I say these assumptions are wrong. There are cultural differences in our countries which make that predict the legislations that we adopt and or that we don't adopt. There's, looking at the responsibility of the state versus the responsibility of the family. This will make legislation very different in the countries where we live. But if we look at independent living as a right and something that allows us to access living ordinary lives, we want to do this no matter what country we are. And also, look, for me, it's not a question of culture or religion. It's a question of a right, and it's also a question of not being oppressed. We can be oppressed whether we live in an institution, but you can also be oppressed in your families. And this is something that we have to be really aware of. For me, it's being independent living, being able to have freedom of communication, being able to exercise our choices. We all have these how do you say, our choices and the way we want to live our lives, no matter which culture we're living in. So we just need access to services, we call them in countries. I've heard this morning we're going to maybe call them support in other countries, but access to be able to live an ordinary life. No democracy is going to be a true democracy without the full participation of all citizens. If I go on to personal assistance, Adolf gave the definition, so I don't need to do that one more time. But I often hear that we can't close the institutions because there's going to be some people that have to live there. And of course, that's an assumption that people with intellectual disability or psychosocial disabilities would have to live in these institutions. But I say no, that's wrong. Sweden, with its legislation giving access to personal assistance to all disabled, well, to certain disabled people, but people with mobility impairment, cognitive disability, do live at home with personal assistance. They're able to live in their own flats. They're able to live their ordinary lives. They may not all be able to make their own decisions, but they're supported decision-making. Access to supported decision-making means that they'll be able to manage their personal assistance. They do have a person, an advocate, or what we call a service garant, a person who is going to be able to make sure that that personal assistant has come to work today if they themselves cannot pick up the telephone and call that person. So personal assistance, for me, it is a human right. And in Sweden, where we show that this group of people do have access to personal assistance, it's not more expensive, and yet they have a much more fantastic quality of life. We don't want to mention cost when it comes to human rights, but then again, sometimes we do. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for very good answers and keeping in line with the time. That is really perfect. Now I come to our next speaker. It's Facundo Chavez Penillas, Disability Advisor at the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he has been involved with many of the studies and work OHCHR has been doing in promoting the idea of rights of persons with disabilities. And also, if I may add, an example that UN sometimes do talk the talk and walk the walk and allow one of us persons with disabilities to show our expertise and help them implement what they have or we have all adopted. So my two questions for Facundo would be, first one would be, please provide some input on how to make support services human rights based. And my second question would be to sort of follow up on what some of the previous speakers were saying, and that is provide some views on the role of family in preventing institutionalization.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would say that services are not disconnected from the general framework that should be providing for a legal structure in that sense. So I would go for something that said Shanta Rao this morning, that is starting from the implementation of other conditions like the full prohibition of deprivation of liberty on the basis of disability under Article 14, the implementation of Article 12, so choice, as is usually presented in Article 19, is an effective right. I would add to the immediate obligations from member states the effective possibility of exercising the choice under Article 12. And in addition to that, then we can move into what would be support services that are human rights based. Some was just presented on that line, which is the people-centered focus on this, so that the person is in control of the services, that has access to them and has effective control on how the services are delivered, whether they are personal assistance or any other kind of support services. In that line, I think it's important that the committee considers in the general comment a number of possible, I would say, countermeasures to face the existing predominance of the charity and medical approaches, law and policy and practice, that could imply, stated in the general comment, that services associated with living independently in the community are to be funded by others than the health system or the charity-based system. Nevertheless, OHCHR suggests that the committee also considers that these systems may be the only ones with resources and political support to provide these services, in which case clean guidelines on safeguards against medical and child-based approaches could largely contribute to guide the states on the direction to realizing the human rights of persons with disabilities. A second point on this, it's very important, it's the linkage between social protection and the provision of services under this perspective. And in that sense, I would like to draw the attention of the committee to a report of the Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities on the issue and the need to include independent living services under the social protection laws. Social protection schemes should consider personal budgets to cope with disability-related extra costs and the direct payment modalities, enabling the person concerned to have control over the expenditures and exercise effective choice. While personal budgets implemented through direct payment had proven to be an effective way of ensuring the provision of services according to the will and preference of the person concerned, many countries are still reluctant to implement this modality, considering that poverty may cause that such funds are used with different ends because there are no appropriate services in the area to hire. Cash transfer social protection schemes should be sufficient to cover poverty-related needs. Nevertheless, this is hardly ever the case in low and middle-income countries. Policymakers face a challenge on the implementation of intermediary services that need to be in place to avoid exposing the person concerned choosing between satisfying minimum needs and counting with the necessary support in their everyday life. So we would like to suggest for the committee to include this perspective in the general comment, recognizing possible alternatives to access the necessary support services in a way that they are respectful of the provisions of Article 19. Regarding the second question, which is how do we see the views and the role of family in preventing institutionalization? Beyond funding structures that aim at ensuring choice and control of the person concerned, households with children with disabilities and older persons with disabilities face particular challenges. Household and family support can also help to reduce rates of institutionalization. Women are usually stigmatized as the natural caregivers, impacting their possibilities to develop their own life plans because they are to be taking care of family members with disabilities. While structural discrimination against women needs to be addressed, this situation is a reality in most countries in the world. Funding structures should aim at supporting households to avoid gender-biased social protection schemes. The Convention recognizes this structural discrimination by association, and we would like to suggest the committee to consider taking the opportunity of this general comment to provide concrete guidance to this issue that impacts disproportionately households primarily supported by women, although not only. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely there was quite a lot of interesting views which committee will rely on when we draft the general comment, and also the thematic studies you referred to are very useful. So now we go to our next speaker, Ms. Fadia Farah, Vice President of Inclusion International and the mother of a person with intellectual disability, part of the self-advocacy movement. And I would like to ask her again two questions. Question number one is, please provide views on the need to invest in self-advocates. And the second question is, please provide views on why institutions should not be a choice for persons with disabilities. You have your 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So as a member of Inclusion International, I would like to say that if you want to help the self-advocate, we have first to help family. Because we know that the family is the first support for a person with intellectual disability, and around the world and across the lifespan, family provide the majority of support to person with intellectual disability. So our family relationships can influence how we feel about ourselves and how we are seen by our communities. The way families support their children with intellectual disability can positively or negatively impact their self-esteem and influence the attitude of the community members. So to have the family to be able to do this, we need a lot of information to give to the family, and the most important one is the importance of sending a person with intellectual disability to school. And when I say school, I'm talking about inclusive school, because inclusive school is a small community, and the person will interact and they will know better how to deal with everybody and how to solve their problems. The second thing, a family needs to help person with intellectual disability to be a good self-advocate is to have a space where they can share information and when they can talk about their concern. They need to know what is available in the community. So by doing all this, family will be able to support and to understand person with intellectual disability, to explain the choices that they have, and to give them the voice so they start talking by themselves and they start to be visible. And when we help the self-advocate to be strong, so they will be able to go and talk in public space. Now for the second question, I thought that the best way to answer is to give you what the self-advocates told us about institution. So they said in institution we don't have relation with people because usually institutions are very far and people are isolated inside the institution. So they don't know how to communicate with persons who are not in the institution, and they found very difficult after this to go and live with the family and interact with the family. In the institution we are humiliated all the time. We don't own anything. We don't receive any education. We are abused. We are not protected. We had no privacy. Institutions are not a place to live. In the institution we don't have life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping up with time excellently. My next speaker on the list is Mr. Abner Manla Paz, President of the Center for Independent Living, Life Haven of Philippines, also member of the board of the National Umbrella Organization of Organizations of Persons with Disabilities of Philippines, and the National Coalition for CRPD in that country. And I have two questions for you, Abner. Question number one is, please briefly explain what role did private and public funders play in supporting development of service of personal assistance in your country. And the second one would be to follow up on some of the things some of the colleagues were saying. What is the role of family member? What is the role of professional personal assistance in providing assistance and support to persons with disabilities? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the roles of the private and public funders in terms of supporting personal assistance service, at the moment there is no public funds being provided to support personal assistance, though we are under negotiation with our government to come up with a pilot implementation of personal assistance in selected communities, but until now we could not agree on the design of the implementation because still they are stuck in the idea of a charity or welfare kind of services, and so and they are really very heavily relying to the role of the family in regards to providing the personal assistance, and we could not agree on those kind of terms, and there are many issues regarding the design that needs to be changed to implement the pilot. And with regard to private sector, of course, it's the idea is really new in the Philippines since we just started to advocate for it in 2010, and that it was really difficult to make sure that people with extensive disabilities are really in the center of the advocacy, because they need personal assistance to be able to participate, to be able to advocate. And because we do not have personal assistance, it's really difficult for them to be in the center of the advocacy. And because of this, we are having difficulty on our advocacy work, because I believe that if they are in the center of this advocacy, it's easier for people to understand. Therefore, we are submitting project proposal, for example, in USAID, where they are open for a project with regards to implementation of independent living, even with OSAID, but unfortunately, they rejected our proposal several times. So it's very unfortunate that we don't really get support in developing countries. I think because of the idea that this is a Western ideals that are not implementable in developing countries. But it is not true. Regarding the second question, I think that it is very important that we understand that there is very contrasting experience between using your family members as your care provider versus the personal assistance provided in an independent living center model. Persons with disabilities, depending on their family members, could not exercise their autonomy and independence. We all know that. For example, they have to adjust to when their family members have time to provide them assistance and support. And family members of persons with disabilities have their own life too that they need to pursue, such as their work, their career, and maybe raising their own family and other activities. And this also includes that they also need to take rest. And this affects how persons with disabilities and their families live their life, not to only mention about daily life activities of persons with disabilities, but also their productivity. Persons with disabilities who needs personal assistance service are denied their right to live independently as compared to other people in the community, because personal assistance service is not being recognized as human rights even after ratification of CRPD in the Philippines. They could not exercise and enjoy their right to be independent and autonomous so that they can make their personal choices equal to others. For example, many of our members could not go to our center to contribute to the work of our organization. This resulted to lower productivity of persons with disabilities. Also, the efficiency of our center to implement our programs and services for persons with disabilities have been affected. Meanwhile, having a personal assistance being paid to provide support and assistance gives persons with disabilities full control of their life, because they can plan and actually execute those plans. And those were their experience when we have a 2-year pilot project funded by the Asia Pacific Network on Independent Living Center. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping up with time excellently, also for bringing in the Global South perspective to this. And I'm really happy that we have type of at least some geographical balance in this panel, actually quite a good one. And so last but not least, our final speaker will be Oliver Lewis, Executive Director of Mental Disability Advocacy Center, an organization which has been very active in both advocating for CRPD and then subsequently for its implementation, monitoring of its implementation. Now, I don't want to end up on a negative note, but I think it's not bad that my first question for Oliver is to point to us some of the key challenges in transition from institutionalization to the use of support services in community, of course with providing us with some of the ideas how those challenges can be overcome, because some of the other panelists have said, well, are you going to address challenges? And I have saved it for the end. And my second question would be, because I always talk about Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as a big jigsaw puzzle. So, of course, Article 19 is interrelated with a number of other articles, but based on what Oliver has submitted to us, there was special focus on the interrelation between Articles 12 and 19 of the Convention, and that was raised by some of the speakers this morning. So, Oliver, floor is yours, 5 minutes. Thank you very much in advance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, about the transition from institutions to the use of support services in the community. I think the lawyer in me would look at the text of the Convention, and the operative verb in Article 9 is to recognise. So in MDAC's experience, the lack of recognition in domestic law is the number one challenge. And to lawyers, recognise means that the rights in Article 19 need to be transmitted into domestic law. That means governments have to adopt legislation to make community living a right. It needs to be a right that people are able to go to domestic courts and claim, and one that judges can order. And in the experience of MDAC, deinstitutionalisation strategies that governments have written often fail to set measurable indicators of progress. They can operate with unreasonably long timelines or exclude certain people or even certain institutions from being shut. For example, in Hungary, the government adopted a strategy in 2011 with a timeline of 30 years. It lacks intermediate measures and excludes children's institutions and institutions for people with psychosocial disabilities. So a timeline of 30 years, that strikes me as unacceptable. So it would be really good if the committee could give some guidance on that. Perhaps the process in all countries which have big or even medium-sized institutions could be 5 years or 7 years or 8 years. It would be great if the committee could give some clear guidance to states. So second of all, I think we shouldn't just focus on deinstitutionalization, which is a process sometimes as difficult to say as it is to implement, because DI, I will use those two words, means essentially evacuation. It's a negative process, and it ends up being an elongated, very difficult to achieve process. Whereas Article 19, which of course doesn't talk about institutions at all, is a much more positive right. And the focus is on community, choice, control, mainstream services, accessibility, and individualized support, as colleagues have already said. That means community investments, not investments into buildings and institutions, but into inclusive education, vocational training, supports for employment, access to housing stock, and so on. My penultimate point is that governments, in our view, should treat people who have been in institutions as victims of torture, inhuman, cruel, and degrading treatment and punishment. And such victims are, under international law, entitled to physical, cognitive, psychological, and legal recovery, rehabilitation, and social reintegration measures. That is mandated, in our view, under Article 16, paragraph 4 of the CRPD, coupled with Articles 25 and 26. And finally on this point, it is a tragedy that throughout the world, deinstitutionalization often ends up being only trans-institutionalization. And that occurs when people are shifted from one institution to another. Now the other one is usually smaller, newer, warmer, and less smelly than the first one. But the second institution is almost invariably called something other than an institution, And usually the words which are given to the second institution sound lovely, like social care home, for example, or living centre, or they sound reassuringly clinical, like assessment unit. But even in these newer, smaller residential setups, an institutional culture often pervades. So, for example, in Moldova, we're working with local NGOs to investigate how 14 young adults were transferred from one institution into quote-unquote community homes. That sounds lovely. But it turns out that these community homes are where the residents receive education and where most of their daily activities are carried out or carried out on them. And actually, all of their lives take place in isolation from the community. Another example is in Romania, NGOs have raised concerns about a new governmental scheme that transfers people into quote-unquote protected homes, where again, an institutional culture pervades. And trans-institutionalization results in violations of Article 19 and other provisions of the CRPD, which brings me on to the second question which you asked, Mr. Chairman, which is the relationship between Article 19 and Article 12. Clearly there is a relationship. One of the people that our organisation has helped, and now his case has become famous, is that of Rusi Stanev, who won his case in 2012 at the European Court of Human Rights, after having spent 8 years involuntarily detained in a social care institution where he tried to escape many times but was brought back. And the reason that he was detained, not in law but in practice, was because he was under guardianship in violation of Article 12. So obviously the relationship is about choice and control. But I should also say that we shouldn't wait for advances in Article 12 to take place before making advances in Article 19, and actually vice versa. We often hear governments saying, oh, we're going to change our civil procedure code and then we might look at shutting down our institutions. Well, one is not predicated on the other. They can happen in parallel, and one human right does not trump the other.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and all the speakers were brilliant in keeping up with time. So this gives us a chance to make this even more interactive. I do have a list of people who have asked for the floor to make questions to the panelists or to maybe make a comment, but I would really like, we have 4 persons, in order so everybody has the opportunity to ask and panelists have enough time to answer. I would like your questions not to exceed 2 minutes, please. Thank you kindly, and Secretariat will assist me with reading out who is the first one to pose the question.
Yes, we would like to have Ms. Tina Minkovic. You have 2 minutes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have several points I'm just going to try to run through quickly. It's essential to reaffirm the Article 14 and 15 jurisprudence that you already put in the guidelines. It's obviously intimately connected with Article 19 implementation. If people are being subjected to even the threat of forced detention and forced treatment, it impedes them from being included as full independent members of the community. Secondly, with regard to having choices, the need to have choices with respect to individual preferences in relation to the acceptability of services. Many of us who have been subjected to forced treatment in the mental health system, for us, it's especially essential that there need to be services completely outside the mental health system that are available to us either on a long-term basis if we need support, or on a short-term basis if just needing for what people call crisis respite or that sort of thing. There's a bill in the United States Senate that has been introduced. I mentioned it in my written submission. It creates a right to long-term support services in the community based on the person's own choices, and it includes emergent and intermittent needs, which is explicitly meant to address the needs that many people with psychosocial disabilities have that are not necessarily long-term in the sense that they just continue indefinitely. Another point I would like to make is another aspect of gender in terms of, for many women, and especially for lesbians, it's important to have female-only spaces and female-only options to meet our support needs. In relation to psychosocial disability or emotional needs, often there are things that become very intimate that one wants to discuss only with members of the same sex. So I think those are some important issues. And lastly, I would like to support the idea of a process, or bring out in a different way. There needs to be, the committee has already talked in the guidelines on Article 14 about reparations in the context of that article. I think we could, I think we could see a process of implementing Article 19 as also including or incorporating this need to start with the fact that people have been victimized, not only by institutionalization, but by forced treatment, and where we go from there. Thank you.
Thank you for raising those important issues. I do hope that following speakers will keep up with the proposed 2-minute framework, so everybody, we have free left for questions or comments. So the next one is
Mr. and Ms. Nena Georgans from the Age Platform Europe. You have the floor for 2 minutes. Please raise your hand and go ahead, please.
Thank you. I represent Age Platform Europe, which is an EU network of organizations of older people, and we represent directly through our membership more than 40 million older persons across the EU. I would like to make 2 points with regard first to the age-based discrimination of older persons, which was previously addressed in this panel, and second, with regard to awareness and involvement of older persons. So what we witness from our members is that there continue to exist laws and policies that exclude older persons with disabilities on the basis of age limits in access to disability benefits, mobility allowances, personal assistance, etc. In addition to that, older persons are often offered less choice and support in the community. The informal caregivers are often do not have the same right to respite care or to financial aid, which in some cases exists for informal caregivers of younger persons with disabilities. The assessment of the care needs of older persons often completely disregard its actual social care needs. So, for example, you might have assistance in medical terms, but not necessarily assistance to get out of the house, or you might have just assistance to bathe and dress the older persons, but not for cooking. So, in some, the support offered to older persons, the community is far from being complete. The problem that we have with these examples that we have gathered with our members is that they sustain this vision of disability in old age as being something normal, unavoidable, and therefore does not need to be challenged. And the problem is that the committee nor the member states have to date addressed this issue. And there is a legal aspect in that, because age-based discrimination can be justified. And as long as we don't have guidelines from the commissions to the extent of which this discrimination can be justified or not, the situation under which we can afford less support and choice to a 70-year-old compared to a 30-year-old person with disability will continue. The second point has to do with awareness and involvement. We have done survey among our 150 member organization which showcased that older persons are not aware of the convention. They even less use the convention in their work, and a very small member organization of AIDS have actually been involved by their national member states in its implementations. So what we have argued is for the committee to do either a general comment or a day of general discussion and involve older persons in order to raise awareness of these issues, encourage member states to involve them in the implementation, but also improve legal clarity that will allow us to have an equal application of the CRPD across the life course. I would like to have your views on that or other ideas so that we can improve this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next question will be given by
Ms. Connie Laurent-Bowie from Inclusion International. You have 2 minutes, ma'am. Could you identify yourself, raising your hand?
Hi, Connie Laurent-Bowie, Inclusion International. I want to just ask the panelists to make a comment regarding the implementation of Article 19 in the Global South. We struggle, I think, with the concept of how to include in the community where there is no infrastructure in communities. So if there is no healthcare system available to the general population, or if there's a very weak education system where there are 90 children in a classroom, or if there are other services that are unavailable to the general community, how do we begin to think about inclusion in the community for people with disabilities? And I guess I would simply put a proviso that the models we have in countries that do have infrastructure are strongly based on disability services. And one of the risks that we have is importing a service model into the Global South. And I think that for our members, what we've heard from self-advocates in the Global South is that that's not really a solution in the context of communities and accessing communities of the Global South. So we've been thinking a lot and would like to hear your comments about how we actually think differently about a model of social inclusion and social connectedness where there are no institutionalized services. And I apologize for using that word in a different sense. I think there are no disability services and there are no community level services for the general population. The risk is that we simply create disability centers, coming back to the discussion we've been having through the day about euphemisms for places where people go to get services. So I think we have to be careful about assuming that the solution in the Global South is to replicate what we've done in other parts of the world and what we've made mistakes on in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Well, it's a very interesting question because we are getting close to out of time, and I would like really to give chance to another person registering for a question. I would like to ask one of the panelists to give very brief response, and then if others have other views, they can interact bilaterally with Ms. Collin. And thank you, with Ms. Collin, thank you very much for your question. So who would like to take it up and give very brief response?
Okay, thank you, Connie. So you give me the chance to answer to your questions. I'm coming from Lebanon, so over there we don't have anything except garbage crisis, war, all this. So yes, the model that are giving are not, we cannot use them in Lebanon and a lot of other countries around in this area. So what we are doing over there is really focus on the role of the family, because the only choice family has now is to wait until our government change and start really implementing the CRPD, which can take ages, or start to do something. So for some families, we refuse to send our son or daughter to institution. So we start doing the work of the state. So we start, we went to the school and we explained the importance of inclusive education. And we start this in few schools, then other schools follow us because other parents went there and they were asking about the same things. The second thing is that we start looking at our son or daughter as a person first, and we discover all their abilities. I'm going to give you an example. Sorry, I repeat myself maybe, but it's this young girl who liked to cook, and no one wanted to teach her. So she starts to learn with her mom, then her grandma, then the extended family, then everybody starts talking about her cook, and friends start to ask her to cook for her. So a network was created around this young lady, and now she's working in a restaurant and she's ready to take all the command that you need. So this is how a family starts something in the community, because the network are really very strong around her. And slowly, yes, in Lebanon we know that now we cannot go and ask to change the law, but a part of the convention is to work on the community, and we start working in the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very good answer. And we have, I believe, this is the last or second, our last colleague who asked for the floor. So, Secretariat will help me once again.
Yes, Miss Charlotte de Kempenaar from UNIA, Belgium. You have 2 minutes, ma'am.
Thank you. I represent the Belgian Interfederal Center for Equal Opportunities, and I would like to ask 2 general questions regarding the interpretation of Article 19, which are linked to recent legislation that has been adopted in Belgium. One of the communities in Belgium has reformed the legislation on disability-specific support. And in the future, the support will be provided in 2 stages. In the first stage, all persons with a recognized disability will receive a fixed amount of money each month, which will be approximately 300 euros. And then the persons with a more severe support need will be able to apply for additional financial support in a second stage of this system. Now, regarding to the system, I have 2 questions. My first question is whether it is acceptable under the CRPD that disability-specific support is provided under the form of a fixed amount of money, not really linked to the needs, the specific needs of the person in question. And my second question is regarding the waiting lists. We expect that for this second stage of the support system, there will be waiting lists. There will not be enough budget to provide each person with the personal budget that they need to pay for the support that they need. And my question is, to what extent is it acceptable under the CRPD that there are waiting lists for people who need support? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, for your second question, I would like to refer you to the concluding observations of the committee to the Belgium, because the issue of the waiting list has already been raised during the dialogue year and a half, I believe, with your country. So I think that's very clear understanding. And for the other one, I expect some of the legal experts will be able to give you a response, but I hope a brief one, maybe 1 sentence, because of the time. Thank you. Who will dare? Yes. Oliver will. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, there's nothing legal or illegal about waiting lists per se, but waiting lists exist because of the pull of the institutions. If systems exist, there will always be people who want to or who are pushed in by other people to use them, because if systems exist, other systems don't exist. So what we would say is that with regard to institutions is that when someone is transferred out or sadly more likely dies, in an institution, that bed in the institution is destroyed so that the person who's at the top of the waiting list cannot get into the institution. That sounds really harsh, but that will put pressure on the local authorities to figure out an alternative. And for the people who are at the bottom end of the waiting list, and this could be 4 or 5 years on the waiting list, there's ample time, there's not a crisis to be able to figure out alternatives. But governments use the fact that waiting lists exist to justify the continuation of a bad service, namely institutions.
Thank you very much. And we have received also a submission from the distinguished representative of Israel, and they will be our final speakers. I am sure that as diplomats you will be mindful of time. And additional fact, we have 5 wheelchair users who need to go down the ramp, which is a bit tricky, especially for colleagues who have more robust wheelchairs. So the floor is yours to distinguished representative of Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And we want to thank you and all the distinguished panelists for their interesting presentation. Israel thanks the committee for convening this meeting and is thankful for having the chance to take the floor. Israel supports the CRPD and the work of the committee, and in this sense we are due to present our initial report very soon. We want to highlight that we also support the CRPD Now campaign and calls upon other states to ratify it. We informed you in our written submission recently that the state is working towards the full implementation of Article 19. So we'd like to highlight some examples of what is going on in Israel right now. We have a law that is the Equals Right for People with Disabilities law that determines the right for people with disabilities to participate equally and actively in society in all spheres of life, and also to provide a fitting response to their unique needs in a manner that will enable them to live their life with the maximum independence, privacy and dignity while fully realizing their abilities and to make decisions that relate to their lives according to their own wishes and preferences. The current Israel policy and the practice aims to the inclusion of people with disabilities in the community and encourage them their participation in the society. Israel is working towards make a reality of the spirit of the CRPD, nothing about us without us. In this context, we have taken some measures that we'd like to highlight. For example, we are giving financial allowance that assists persons with disabilities to live independently in the community and allows them to hire personal assistants. We assist them in making adaptations to apartments, making them accessible for the needs of people with disabilities. We have out-of-home services, including the right of every person with intellectual disability to be eligible for a place of living and treatment according to his or her need, fully funded by the state. And the work of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Social Services, who applies inclusion and participation in the community as the guiding principles in their work towards different programs, including integrated education, mainstream daycare facilities, and employment. We have a supportive surrounding program that provides support and assistance services and advice for persons who live independently in their homes. Additionally, individual support is given by personal rehabilitation support workers and in centers. We have a preparatory program for independent life with centers and professionals. We are getting help for people and coaching them towards independently living in the community. Mr. Chairperson, the current Israeli policy is integrating persons with disabilities into the community, and it's gradually being implemented. Part of the challenge that Israel faces in the next several years is to further change the perception of all the relevant parties involved, as well as in the implementation of the importance of living in the community in accordance with the CRPD, allowing every person with disability who desires and is able to do so to live in community settings, and greatly reducing new admissions to larger out-of-home arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this brief and to-the-point statement. I have to say, committee looks very much forward to the review of your country's initial report on implementation of CRPD, and thank you so much for sharing this interesting and most welcome news with us. I have been told by my excellent colleague from Secretariat that one of the panelists wishes to take the floor for very briefly one sentence, and that after that it will be the closure of the session. So, please.
I'm most obliged, Chair. I just want to come back to the Belgian question because I think it's so important, and it brings up in stark relief the difference between the medical model, the social model, and the human rights model that we're all aiming toward. The big problem with the medical model wasn't primarily an abuse of medicine by the medical profession, although that was there, especially in the psychosocial domain. The big problem was the abuse of the medical model by public policy makers and people who designed social protection systems. So in their mind, a particular impairment attracted a particular tariff. That is classic medical model approaches. And I would put it to you that Article 19 attempts to stand that on its head completely and to try and create some more sensitivity, not just to the traditional needs of the person, but to the actual social desires of the person to connect with his or her community. So thankfully I'm not on the UN committee, but if I were, I'd probably be minded to characterize the Belgian legislation as a violation of Article 19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you to Ms. Harvey from Secretariat for the support. Thanks to all of you for your attention. I ask you all to remain in the hall. It will take us a couple of minutes for this set of panelists to leave the stage and allow the next group in. And Carl, you can bring the hammer down. Session is closed. Thank you.